I want to emphasize at the outset that this represents the work of a lot of people, including several people who are in the audience today. I'm going to skip the explanation of why SAV are important. That would definitely be preaching to the converted for this crowd. And I'm going to sort of cover three basic things. We're going to look at some statistical analysis of digital maps for the entire system. So a very broad scale, bay-wide analysis. Another component of the study was looking at a field study where transects adjacent to natural and riprapped shorelines were measured. And then I'm going to end with kind of the summary headlines and take-home messages from the work. Okay, so looking first at these broad-scale models, what we call the sub-estuary scale. And we're calling it that because we looked at about 100 study sub-estuaries. These are, again, small embayments around the edge of Chesapeake Bay and on the mid-Atlantic coastal bays. We like them because they give us replication, replicated study units that we can look at. They're good for looking at land-water connections because the local watersheds of these sub-estuaries have contrasting land uses. The main data set that we analyzed was the aerial survey of submerged aquatic vegetation, which has been undertaken every year but one since 1984. So it's a pretty amazing data set covering this entire study area. We also looked at the National Land Cover data set to quantify land use and land cover within these study systems. We were interested in how salinity was affecting the responses of SAV, so we looked at different salinity zones. And we also had available maps of the condition of the shoreline, which were developed by the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, and those were useful for telling us whether or not shorelines were armored, and also what the land use directly on the shoreline was. So let me go directly into presenting some of the results of this work. One of the first findings I want to mention is that we saw effects of watershed land use on SAV abundance when we compared among the sub-estuaries. And this is an analysis that illustrates that. What we're looking at here on the y-axis is SAV abundance. And this was quantified by looking at the area of SAV in the sub-estuary and comparing it to the potential habitat area. So it's the percentage of potential habitat that was occupied. And we defined potential habitat as basically the water that's 2 meters deep or less. The analysis is a repeated measures analysis of variance. So we have these different land cover categories. And we use the data from all of the years as the response variable. And what we're seeing here with these letters that show us things that are significantly different is that when we look across a gradient, starting with more natural systems, forested systems on the right, and moving over to more disturbed systems, developed and agricultural on the left, we're seeing very significant differences between the percent of potential habitats that's occupied in the sub-estuary. So a very strong and significant land use effect. We could also look at univariate correlations between SAV abundance and various stressors. We found that the forest directly on the shoreline was positively related to SAV abundance, and that's illustrated in this figure, percent of forested shoreline on the x-axis, and the same measure of SAV abundance on the y-axis. Surprisingly, we found that the percentage of marsh on the shoreline in the sub-estuary was negatively related to SAV abundance. And we were surprised to see this, but we think it may be related to the fact that these marshes may release peat or mud into the surrounding water, which provides a less suitable substrate for several of the SAV species. We also found that armoring at the scale of the entire sub-estuary was negatively related to SAV abundance. And that's shown in this graph, which is showing us the percentage of the sub-estuary shoreline that's riprapped and SAV abundance. And there's a clear negative correlation that is significant. But as with the previous two plots, what we're seeing is that we actually have what we're calling sort of a triangular response, where at high values of the stressor, the response is pretty much going to be low, but at low values you can have a whole range of responses, and this probably reflects the fact that there's many stressors, and even when this one is low, other stressors could be reducing SAV abundance. So one approach to that is to look at multivariate models. This is just an example of one of the models that we attempted, which showed that a combination of shoreline, armoring, and land use could predict SAV abundance pretty effectively. This is a CART model. CART is good for things that don't necessarily follow a strict linear relationship, like these triangular distributions that I showed. And this particular model was based on 3 variables: the percentage of riprap, the percentage of herbaceous wetland in the watershed, and the percentage of cropland in the watershed. And it broke the subestuaries into 4 groups with SAV abundance ranging from around 1% to up to 10% across the 4 groups. And this particular model explained about 40% of the variation in SAV abundance among the subestuaries. We also found that SAV abundance was greater and recovery was stronger in subestuaries with little armoring. And this kind of follows on the CART model that I just showed you. We had that first breakpoint in the CART model, which separated the subestuaries into 2 groups: those with less than 5% riprap and those with more than 5% riprap. And if we use repeated measures analysis of variance to look at the time trends in SAV abundance in these 2 groups, we can see that they're quite different. Those with more riprap showed recovery in the initial part of the time series, and then after about the mid-90s, they sort of oscillated around a more stable value with not so much recovery. And in contrast, those with less riprap have showed a trend of recovery throughout the time period. I want to emphasize that this particular analysis doesn't show that riprap is the cause of these patterns. We know that higher riprap is associated with a lot of other stressors within the system, like more development. But it does show between the more and the less stressed systems a very clear difference in the response. Now I'd like to look at a finer scale of thinking about the system, what we've called shoreline scale models. And the objective of this is to compare the SAV directly adjacent to a particular piece of shoreline, thinking about natural riprap and bulkheaded shorelines. And again, to use the subestuaries to put those shoreline segments in a larger context of the land use of the local watershed, and also to think about their responses in different salinity zones. So I want to emphasize this as a shift to a much finer scale. For example, here's the St. Mary's River watershed. At the subestuary scale, we would have one number, say, describing the percentage of cropland in the watershed. And we would have one number describing the occurrence of riprap, like we would say 20% of the shoreline is riprap. At the shoreline scale, we're actually looking at these individual little pieces of shoreline that are mapped here, and looking only at the SAV that's directly adjacent to that particular piece of shoreline. We found that armoring effects varied with the SAV communities. And here we were using salinity as a proxy for the SAV communities. So down in the polyhaline zone, the SAV in that area showed pretty clear patterns of response to shoreline hardening. We saw that bulkheads had significantly less SAV directly adjacent to the piece of shoreline, significantly less than natural shorelines, and riprap was in between, not significantly different from either end member, but the 2 end members were highly significantly different. In the mesohaline zone, where there's different SAV communities, we saw a significant effect of bulkhead in comparison to the other 2 shoreline types, but we didn't see a difference between natural shoreline and riprap. And in the oligohaline zone, we didn't see any significant effects of shoreline hardening on SAV abundance. We also found that land use in parts of the system seemed to constrain the response to shoreline hardening. So the patterns were again clearest down here in the polyhaline zone. So here we're looking at the three shoreline types again, but we're also looking at the dominant land use of the subestuaries. So we're seeing across the three groups that are presented here: forest, mixed watersheds, and human-dominated watersheds, which are either agriculturally or developmentally dominated. We're seeing a clear pattern where the natural watersheds have higher SAV abundance than the mixed ones, and the human-dominated ones have very little SAV. The patterns were less clear in the mesohaline zone, as I showed in the previous slide. We did see the effect of shoreline hardening again, but surprisingly, forested watersheds had less SAV in the polyhaline zone than the other two types. In the oligohaline zone, we saw more SAV in the forested watersheds, but not much difference between the mixed and the human-dominated ones. So the next thing I want to talk about is the field study, where we actually measured SAV in 24 study subestuaries. 17 of these were surveyed once, and 7 of them were surveyed repeatedly every year. Again, they were arranged in different dominant land use and salinity zones. The field survey was designed like this. We're interested in contrasting natural and riprapped shorelines. And here's a picture that shows what one situation of this looks like out in the field with the riprap and the natural shoreline here. This is kind of an aerial cartoon view of an SAV bed next to each shoreline type. And two transects of 11 quadrats were deployed along each shoreline. And the quadrats look like this. And on a relatively clear day, you could actually see someone surveying the quadrat possibly. SAV cover was measured in the quadrats. And that's one of the responses we'll be looking at. Also frequency, how many of the quadrats had SAV, the width of SAV beds, and also the depth of the SAV bed at the start. So one of the findings was that riprap can significantly reduce SAV cover, and this was a significant effect in the oligohaline zone. It was also apparent but not significant in the mesohaline zone, and not so apparent in the polyhaline zone. Another one of the response variables was bed width, and in this case the riprap shorelines had lower bed width in all three salinity zones. Riprap also reduced the frequency of SAV and increased the depth of the start of the bed, but I don't have the graphs to show for those. Because these transects were arrayed in subestuaries with different land cover, that effect could also be examined. So this is the total SAV cover, and as with the previous analysis based on the bay-wide aerial photography, we again have a gradient from more natural forested systems over here to more disturbed, and we're again seeing a strong land use effect. And that's also true looking at bed width as the response variable. Okay, so we have a case where we're kind of confirming between the field study and the study based on aerial mapping the same findings. I want to say something briefly about living shorelines. We didn't really study these in detail, but one of the shorelines in the field study was a living shoreline, which had a Phragmites marsh actually behind the riprap sill that was placed out in the water. For this one study site, we did see that the riprap shoreline, in this case a living shoreline, had lower SAV cover in all but one of the study years, and the bed width was lower in all of the study years. So again, it's just one case, but it suggests that we may want to be cautious when we're thinking of installing living shorelines, it still has potentially significant effects on SAV. So let me just briefly go through the summary headlines. Again, a local watershed land use can affect subestuary SAV abundance, with lower abundance in watersheds dominated by agricultural or developed land. And we saw that in our study of the bay-wide aerial photography, and we also saw that in the field study of the transect measurements. We found that shoreline hardening can reduce SAV abundance. We saw that in the field study. Here, bed width is significantly different in every salinity zone. And we also saw that in the polyhaline, in the study of the bay-wide SAV maps. We saw the effect of bulkhead in the mesohaline zone, but not a significant effect in the oligohaline zone. So the effects seem to differ among the zones and seem to be strongest in the polyhaline. And we also see that bulkhead has stronger effects than riprap in general. Again, we saw that living shorelines may reduce SAV, and we need to think about that when we're thinking of even using this method as a way of armoring shorelines. We found that shoreline hardening can have more impact on SAV in subestuaries with healthy watersheds. We saw that most strongly here in the polyhaline zone. And we also saw in the oligohaline zone that the forested systems had higher SAV abundance than the other systems. So particularly in the polyhaline zone, shoreline effects were weaker where development, where agriculture had already really reduced the SAV population. We found that natural shorelines are not all equal. We saw that forested shorelines were positively related to SAV abundance, but shoreline marsh was negatively related, possibly because of this effect of supplying mud or peat to the adjacent water. So a final point that I want to emphasize that's come out over and over again in this work is that the stressor impacts really differ among SAV species and salinity zones. So when we think of the Chesapeake Bay, we have a salinity gradient, and we typically divide the bay into these four zones, polyhaline up to oligohaline and tidal fresh. The species occur in different places in the bay. There's a couple that occur mainly in the lower bay in the salty water. There's a whole group that appears more in the middle water, and then there's several freshwater species that occur in the oligohaline zone and the tidal fresh zone. These species prefer sandy substrates where these species are able to tolerate mud. These two species are invasive canopy formers, and that gives them the potential to grow up and reach the surface and overcome water clarity limitations because the leaves are just deployed right at the surface. There's also a gradient in light need, with the species that occur in the lower bay needing a higher percentage of incident light to reach the leaves than the species in the middle and the upper bay. So we really think that these communities probably need different management strategies. They're responding to stressors differently. So when we're thinking management and restoration, we need to account for that. And we also want to make the point that salinity is probably a poor proxy for these community types. And one of the things we're working on now is developing a better description of these communities so that we can look at the communities as a factor rather than as salinity itself. So I'll stop there, and I want to acknowledge our sponsors.
Thanks, Colin.